Hello and good evening. I want to thank our viewers for joining us here tonight. So far, we have had the opportunity to hear from some incredible leaders, folks who are on the front lines day in and day out fighting for a more inclusive and just world. I'm so excited to welcome two extraordinary advocates, Mayor Michael Tubbs from Stockton and community organizer Sadalia King. So I'm going to get right to the point. There is nothing new about systemic racism in the United States, but the recent murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and others do seem to have sparked a national reckoning about racial injustices and inequities. We have seen an increase of support for Black Lives Matter, the movement, and mass acknowledgement of institutional racism. Anti-racism has been deemed the buzzword of the year. And although these are small steps in the right direction, I think we all recognize that there is so much more to do. The events of this year have starkly exposed the persistent inequities in healthcare, wealth, public safety, education, and opportunity between Black and white Americans. We know that 1 out of every 1,000 Black men in this country will die at the hands of police. We know that Black people are 3 times more likely than whites to contract COVID-19. And while we are talking about this election, because we are talking about this election, let's not forget this. 1 in 13 Black Americans of voting age are disenfranchised and cannot participate in our democracy. For those of us who can vote, we absolutely must. The fight for racial injustice does not end at the ballot box, but it is a necessary and important step along the way. I would argue it is our obligation. As election day draws nearer, I find myself thinking about the impact this election could have on the fight for racial justice. I think about what our country could look like in 40 or 50 years when my stepchildren are much older. And the decisions that we are making now and the decisions that are being put in front of us will have a dramatic impact on their safety, their access to reproductive rights, their ability to seek education, and their ability to love who they want to love. It also makes me think about my great-great-grandmother who was a slave and who was freed by Abraham Lincoln, and how the rest of her life she stayed engaged in politics because of that. And the obligation that I have to remember that part of my history and to never forget what can happen when you don't have the right of your body or of your voice. So let's get to it. Mayor Tubbs, Sadalia, I'd love to hear from you. Why is this election so important? And what are you hearing and seeing in your communities?
So yeah, you definitely hit on like a lot of the really big topics that happened just not even a couple months ago. And if anything, what makes this election so important is, and what we're seeing in communities is that folks are really a lot more engaged, especially in the aftermath of George Floyd. We saw like our representatives react in real time to what the protests brought about and what the policy demands were. And there's been some resistance and also some compromises being made or have been made since that came to fruition. So, and a lot of that we saw like from even cities that painted Black Lives Matters in their streets. But when we're trying to continue these conversations, we're not really seeing them pursue these opportunities to address what the community's demands are. Or even if they do, maybe they're doing some more so under the guise of justice and equity and not really in practice. So if anything, like what we're seeing now is that folks are realizing it's not just so much as having like these representatives in these spaces. It's just like, are they going to really be in tune with the community and be responsive to them? And there's like a national dialogue going on about how representation alone isn't enough. Like it's not so much as that, like whether or not we're seeing these representatives and when it comes to like the oppressive systems. So like, for instance, when we're talking about Breonna Taylor, we definitely see like their attorney general. So if it's like an oppressive system, but in Black, that's not really the change that we really need to see. That's not really representation. So when it comes to these voters, folks are like really questioning their policies. They're really questioning like whether or not like this person is going to not only reflect who I am visibly, but are they going to actually advocate and bring about that policies that I want to see in my world, not only for my world, but for the next generation.
Absolutely. And first, thank you, Sadalia, for your work, not just on the panel, but in the work you do each and every day in the community. And thank you, Assemblymember, for your leadership on bills of consequence that speak to where we should be as a state. And thank you, Planned Parenthood, for the work you all do to provide reproductive justice and equity in health to all people, including Black women. In terms of your question, this election is so important, not because Donald Trump is the first white supremacist we've had in the White House, but this election can ensure that he is the last. I think this election is incredibly important because we've seen in 4 years the amount of damage that has been done to everything from healthcare to the environment, even to the conversations people are having, to have a president emboldened white supremacists refuse to disavow white supremacy and tell folks to stand by until further notice. It's a very perilous time for our country, to be frank. And I think we see that if you look at the intense activity around voter suppression. If this election wasn't that important, we wouldn't see sort of the farce of a Supreme Court nomination we had to undergo through 2 times in this term, and most recently in the last couple of weeks. You wouldn't see the president and the vice president of these United States casting doubts on the efficacy of mailing in ballots, of saying even before any ballots have been counted that this election is illegitimate, that this fraudulent voting happened. It's because it's real fear that we're at a turning point, just given the demographics and then given the kind of awakening that's happened in the midst of the atrocities of COVID-19 and the violence, not just police violence, but really the violence of poverty and racism in our country. So this election is important as a starting point, but not an ending point, meaning we have to organize. We have to vote. And then after we vote, we're voting not because Joe and Kamala in and of themselves have all the answers, even though I love them dearly. We're voting to create the terrain where organizers like Sadalia can do their work and push, but push on terrain that's familiar, push on terrain that's friendly, push on terrain that's listening, and that can be pushed to create the communities we all deserve.
We have to wrap up here shortly, but when things are feeling heavy or hopeless, I was wondering, where do you two find joy and inspiration right now?
I have a son who just turned 1 year old. So he was, first year of life was in the midst of this, and just seeing this Black boy with all the potential in the world, with the brilliant smile, a sense of self, a spirit that's light. It's just like he just deserves so much more. And I think that's what keeps me going. But I'm not gonna lie, this has been a very difficult year, particularly being a mayor of a very diverse city, a mayor who has a police department that I have to hold accountable, but also have to work with, a mayor that has to balance and work with folks who disagree with me vehemently on issues. And some folks even disagree on my basic humanity. And just seeing kind of the ravage that COVID-19 has caused to everyone, but particularly to communities of color, particularly to Black people and Black businesses. To see, I'm only 30 years old, so my whole adolescence, teen years, and adulthood has been marked by Sean Bell, Trayvon Martin, Troy Davis, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown. I've been planning protests and rallies about these things since I was 18 years old. And it's like, well, is it going to get better? It's what's changed between now and 2010 or now in 2014. So that's kind of the emotional and pessimistic part. But I'm also optimistic. One of my mentors is Mary Wright Elderman from the Children's Defense Fund. And she told me that it's a privilege to struggle for justice and that you're in a long line of folks, of angels who have been on this earth, who have pushed and made us better. Pushed and made us better with even less opportunity than exists today. So I think that's what gives me the optimism, and also seeing just the amount of people who took to the streets this year. And the protests looked different from the protests I was in college, because they were diverse. It wasn't just Black people protesting, it was everyone out in these streets saying, no, Black lives matter. No, human dignity is important. No, we want to have a system of true equality and liberty and justice for all. So a mix of emotions, angry for sure, but also optimistic that this time we're going to get it right and we're going to do the work to make sure that's so.
Yeah, actually, I would piggyback off of a lot what Mayor Tubbs just mentioned. If anything, I feel what kind of is getting me past or get me by is reflecting on history and then also seeing it practiced out in art. And so one of my really favorite shows right now is Lovecraft Country. It's on HBO. And see, Mayor Tubbs loves it too.
But we just started watching it. It scares me, but it's so deep.
It's so good. And if you like that one, I don't know if you watched it. It was last year's Watchmen.
I haven't watched that yet, but
so good, so good. Watchmen ran so then Lovecraft could fly, like real talk. But it just does such a really great job using art to talk about like this untold history of the Black experience in America. And both of them like center a lot of the story on Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the burning of Black Wall Street. So in the midst of that heartbreak, you still see Black joy, you still see Black life, you still see like the resilience and hope behind a lot of that. And if anything, like, yeah, you see that playing out on screen, and there's tons of fictionalization. It's a sci-fi show, but you still, as a Black person living in the year 2020, you still connect with that. There's still that ongoing resilience and struggle and fight because you can't stop here. And if anything, you realize that you're part of this larger legacy. Like, you might not know the individual folks who died in that massacre, but you connect with their story. You're still living with the fact that they fought too. And then if anything, you're in this space now because of them, and you're fighting for the next person or persons to have a better starting than what you arrived at. So and so even in the midst of like that art, and now seeing it really being celebrated and appreciated, and I'm part of a like a book club, sort of, I guess is what the equivalent of book club would be. We meet every week and we talk about what we saw on the show. But like small organizing like that, that's more social and community focused. But even when we're talking about the larger piece of this election, we're seeing young people organize because they're learning this too, and they're seeing it, and they're seeing what's going on now. And if anything, they definitely realize that there's some struggle and like the adults like trying to fix this. So we're starting to see like our young folks really organize and trying to push their own agenda, because this is their future that they're fighting for. And we also owe it to them to be responsive to that. So like through art, through hope, through justice, through resilience, that's sort of where I find my happy place, and seeing the future hold a lot more promise.
And let me just jump in and say, I think what trips me up about Lovecraft is that even with all the horrors, even with the paranormal, even with demons and witches and ghosts, racism is so insidiously horrific and terrifying. I literally was watching, I was like, oh my gosh.
Yep.
Like, just living with such racism is actually terrifying. This is actually a horror film.
Absolutely, it completely is. And I believe it was the first episode, and they had they either had to go outside and face the monsters or possibly stay inside and face these really racist officers. And then, if anything, I was like, and it was like in the midst of the George Floyd bit too, or I was reflecting on George Floyd. I was like, wow, it's sort of like either you stay home and deal with the pandemic, or you go out, or you go outside and deal with the pandemic, or you just kind of twiddle your thumbs or whatnot. But it's just like sort of that damned if you do, damned if you don't, like whether or not you choose to engage. Especially since COVID disproportionately affects the Black community. And then do you risk that for fighting for justice when it came to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor? Like, there's just so many pieces from that show that just lands on just the experience that we're living through today.
I mean, when I feel overwhelmed by the daunting task before us, talking to folks like you, my heroes and my sheroes, you know, out there doing the hard work and on the front lines, it re-energizes me. I don't know if y'all have seen Lizzo's Billboard music acceptance speech from the other night, but I wanted to share her incredible message. She said, I've been thinking a lot about suppression and the voices who have refused to be suppressed. And I wonder, would I be standing right here now if it weren't for the big Black women who refused to have their voices suppressed? 2 snaps, Lizzo. When people try to suppress something, it's because that thing holds power. People are afraid of your power. I think some people are just afraid of Black women, but that's for another discussion. There is power in your voice. So whether it's through music, protest, or your right to vote, use your power. Use your voice and refuse to be suppressed. We have days until the election, 13 days. So if you haven't sent in your ballot, you better do it today. Do it now. And if you have forgotten to register, you have moments. Don't worry though. In California, you can register up until Election Day. So please find your nearest vote center and get registered. This election is our opportunity to make big changes on the local, state, and at the federal level. Don't sit on the sidelines. There is just too much at stake. Please vote. Thank you.